Hey everybody, it's your human anatomy and physiology teacher, Mr. Poser. Today we are finishing up our unit on the cardiovascular system by discussing the other half of the cardiovascular system, the vascular part, which is blood vessels. All right, so we've talked about the heart a lot, how it contracts, how it regulates its contraction, how it moves blood from one place to the next, the anatomy of the heart. Now we're getting into blood vessels. There's 5 different kinds of them, and we're also going to discuss blood pressure and how that's regulated. Well, not necessarily how it's regulated, but the factors that affect the blood pressure. All right, so as I said, we got 5 different types of blood vessels we're going to discuss today. We have arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins. And here's the fun fact. If you took every one of your blood vessels, including every one of your tiny, tiny capillaries that are like a micrometer wide, and you put them in a straight line, that line would be long enough to extend to the moon and back, which is pretty fantastic. That's a long way. So your blood's got to make a pretty long trip, and it makes that whole trip, several times a day, which is amazing, if you ask me. So the first type of blood vessels that we're going to discuss is arteries. Arteries are the strongest, most elastic vessels that transport blood away from the heart under high pressure. Okay, arteries transport blood away. Arteries equals away. I want to reiterate that. They both start with A, so you can remember which one's which. Okay. Arteries branch off into arterioles, which are subdivisions or branches of arteries, and they're thinner and finer than the arteries, right? So your arteries, they're branching off of the aorta, which is the largest vessel. So you're going to have arteries like the subclavian, the carotid, the brachial artery, the femoral artery, all sorts of different major blood vessels that they have a wide diameter and they're strong and elastic. Okay, then those will branch off into various arterioles. Okay, here's a couple things about the structure of arteries, though. I have a diagram of like the anatomy of an artery here, because there's 3 layers to it, and I'm not going to make you memorize the layers, but they're kind of like the layers of the heart wall a little bit. There's endothelium, there's smooth muscle, and there's connective tissue. And that smooth muscle part becomes very, very important when it comes to regulating both body temperature and blood pressure. Because the amount of blood flowing through and the volume of blood flowing through arteries can affect blood flow and blood pressure. Okay, so a couple topics that we've discussed in this class before when we were discussing temperature regulation and the integumentary system and fight or flight a little bit. That has to do with these 2 concepts of vasoconstriction and vasodilation. So the smooth muscle walls in these arteries are able to reduce or increase the diameter of the artery, which can allow for more or less blood flow. Right? When it comes to temperature regulation, arteries and arterioles that are vasodilated are going to be releasing more heat, and it's going to try and cool you down. While vessels that are vasoconstricted, okay, are going to be reducing blood flow and thus trying to conserve heat. So when you're cold and you're shivering, right, you're also going to be vasoconstricted in your skin. And when you're hot and sweaty, okay, the blood vessels, or particularly the arteries and arterioles near your skin, are going to be vasodilated to try and get rid of that excess heat. Also influences blood pressure. All right, this is going to have less blood pressure than this one. There's less of a force being exerted on the vessel walls when there's more space, or when there's less space in what we call the lumen, or the diameter of the blood vessel. Okay. So yeah, and this is another way that your cardiovascular system regulates how much blood various parts of your body get, right? So think about fight or flight for a second, all right? You're getting attacked by a bear in the woods or something like that. Your blood, your cardiovascular system is not going to be focusing on getting blood to, say, your digestive system or your reproductive system when you're about to die from a bear attack, right? It's going to be sending more blood. It's going to be delivering more blood to your brain, and it's going to be delivering more blood to your muscles in order to try to act quickly, right? So that's another way that fight or flight is kind of regulated, and blood flow is regulated through vasodilation and vasoconstriction in arteries. All right, so that is something that I'm going to ask you to know. Let's talk about capillaries. Capillaries are the smallest diameter blood vessels that connect the smallest arterioles and the smallest venules. All right, so let's walk through this for a second here. All right, we're talking about arteries carrying blood away from the heart. If we're talking about systemic arteries, we went from the aorta, and then the aorta branches off into various arteries, and those arteries branch off into various arterioles. Okay, but when it's about to reach its destination, it has to pass through capillaries, which are these tiny, tiny, very small blood vessels. And they are the most permeable. vessels, and they're the really small. In fact, the capillaries themselves are typically only one layer of epithelial cells thick, okay? And they're small enough, they have such a small diameter that only one red blood cell can pass through a capillary at any given time. Or like, they have to go one by one. They have to go single file, that's what I meant to say. And why is that? Well, it's easy for oxygen and carbon dioxide to diffuse through and nutrients to diffuse through and wastes because the cells are so close to the tissues over here. Okay, the red blood cells are so close to the tissues, and the blood is so close. All it has to do is pass through one cell. Okay, so think about this: the systemic circuit. There's a point where oxygen-rich blood draw an arrow to the body, and then it becomes oxygen-poor blood, right? So this is the other area of gas exchanges in capillary beds in the systemic circuit. Okay, so that oxygen from your lungs has made its trip back into the heart, out to the arteries, now it's down to the capillaries, and it finally drops off the oxygen and the nutrients, and then picks up the carbon dioxide and waste so that it can return back to the heart and, well, return and be gotten rid of. Okay, so that waste is going to be disposed of by the urinary system. Carbon dioxide, you're going to breathe that out, right? So your lungs are going to breathe that out. So this is where the other gas exchange is occurring. It's in these tiny capillaries, and that's where diffusion occurs. Okay, so yeah, that's a really important point to make here, is that capillaries, that's where the gas exchange occurs. And once it drops off that oxygen and drops off the nutrients, picks up the carbon dioxide and waste, venules, our vessels, are going to bring that oxygen-poor blood back to the heart so that it can pick up some more oxygen again. So vessels that continue from the capillaries and merge to form veins are venules, okay? So it goes arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, these smaller versions of veins, and then they kind of collect and pool into, or I shouldn't say they pool, but they branch to form veins. Okay, and veins are the vessels that transport the blood back to the atria. Okay, the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava are the two largest veins in the body. They're bringing them both back to the right atrium. Okay, just like the pulmonary veins are bringing blood back to the left atrium. Okay, so the pulmonary veins are the only veins in the body that are carrying deoxygenated blood, just like the pulmonary arteries are the only arteries in the body that's carrying deoxygenated blood. Okay, difference between veins and arteries in another way, besides the direction of blood flow. Veins have thinner walls and they have valves, especially the lower extremities of veins, have valves that prevent backflow. Okay, so, you know, if you're bringing blood back from your feet, let's just say, they have to fight against gravity, right? They're going to fall back down otherwise. But thankfully, veins have valves which prevent that backflow and prevent blood from, like, pooling down in your feet. Okay, they fight gravity, right? So varicose veins, this is a picture I found here. Varicose veins, this is what happens when you get older. You know, the valves kind of break down a little bit, and then the blood can kind of collect a little bit, and it doesn't form right. And yeah, that's when you get varicose veins. Okay. Let's talk about blood pressure, because, you know, more serious diseases have to do with blood pressure than with, you know, broken valves. All right. So blood pressure, what it is, it's the force the blood exerts on the inner walls of the blood vessels. And it's also the force that allows blood to circulate, right? So your heart, really what it's doing by pumping, it's producing pressure. Okay? It's making sure that blood goes from one area to the next by pushing it, by pressuring it, and forcing it through all these different tubes, right? So two different types of pressure that we're going to talk about. And if you've ever, you know, gotten your blood pressure taken before, which I assume everybody has, then you're going to hear numbers like 120 over 80 or like 110 over 60 or something like that. And what are those two numbers? Well, they're two different types of blood pressure. Okay, the systolic pressure is the maximum pressure during ventricular contraction, and the diastolic pressure is the lowest pressure that remains in the arteries before the next ventricular contraction. Okay, so the systolic pressure is the pressure that's happening during ventricular systole, meaning that ventricles, the left ventricle and the right ventricle, are contracting. And then the diastolic pressure is the lowest pressure that remains once in ventricular diastole, when the ventricles are fully relaxed. Okay, so here's a little chart. You know, your normal blood pressure is supposed to be 120 over 80 or around there. If you're elevated, means you might be in a stressful situation or something like that. You might be a little above 120. If you've got high blood pressure, okay, you're 130 or 140 or higher, that's called hypertension. 80 to 89 for diastolic, 90 or higher for systolic, that's high blood pressure. And if you're, about to have a stroke or about to have a heart attack, okay, you're going to have super high blood pressure. That is what we call a hypertensive crisis. And what could happen is that blood vessel could tear, you could clot, and you could, yeah, that'd be bad. Okay, that's remember, heart disease is the #1 cause of death in the United States. It's not COVID-19. It's not Alzheimer's or I don't know, car crashes or anything like that. It's heart disease. Okay, and that's mostly due to our diets and our ways of life that are really prone to increasing blood pressure. And once blood pressure is increased and it's elevated for too long, a tear can form in the blood vessel. It's going to start clotting, and that clot can move from one area to the next and block the coronary arteries going to the heart, or arteries going to the brain, something like that. Okay, but blood pressure is checked with a very, very good word, a device called a sphygmomanometer. And if you've ever used one of these, I know they have different tools now, but if you've ever used one of these, you pump up the air and there's a cuff around your brachial artery. And what that's supposed to do, okay, you're supposed to put it about right here. What that's supposed to do is apply enough pressure with air, okay, to cut off circulation for a little bit. Okay, and then whoever's taking your blood pressure is going to release the air pressure a little bit, and they're going to listen for a doo, doo, and that release of that blood, and it's finally flowing through after it's been cut off, and that's how you get your systolic pressure. Okay, and then they keep listening, keep listening, keep listening, keep listening, and then the pressure that they no longer hear a sound when blood is flowing nicely through and it's not blocked up by the cuff anymore. That's how you get your diastolic pressure. I have some sphygmomanometers here. I don't know if they work all that well though, so we'll see. Your pulse is caused by expanding and recoiling of the arterial wall near the body surface, right? So here's a good place to take your pulse. Here's a good place to take your pulse. And again, you can't use your thumb, okay, because that's got its own kind of pulse. But here's a good spot to take your pulse. And your pulse is really caused by arteries expanding and contracting, systolic, diastolic pressure. It gives a good indication of heart rate. How many times does it contract in a minute? Hey, last thing I want to talk about here, what changes blood pressure? How is that force exerted in the vessel or on the vessel walls? How is that going to be changed? It can be changed by blood volume, okay, like the total amount of space your blood takes. If there's a ton of water in it, that's blood volume. Your heart rate, okay, how many times does your heart beat every minute? Blood viscosity, how thick is it? Okay, a lot of salt, a ton of salt can reduce the amount of water in your blood and make it kind of thicker. And if it's thicker, your heart has to work harder and apply more pressure in order to try to get that thicker substance through, and that can cause problems. So a lot of salt in your diet is not a good thing. The stroke volume, amount of blood, or the volume of blood that enters arteries, how much blood can your heart pump with every pump? That's a pretty big deal too. Peripheral resistance, the friction between the blood and the walls of the vessels. And then finally, vessel diameter via vasoconstriction or vasodilation. Those are all factors that affect how high or how low your blood pressure is. Okay, so heart disease and, like strokes, heart attacks, they kind of stem from, blood pressure. Okay, and these factors that affect that blood pressure, right? So if you've got too high of blood pressure, that's called hypertension. Hypertension can lead to strokes and heart attacks. Okay, so if you're putting enough pressure on that thin wall, it can form a tear, and when your blood vessel tears, it's going to form a clot, right? Hemostasis. Your platelets are going to start collecting, and it's going to start to form a clot, and that clot can be a bad thing, and that clot can be dislodged, and then it can move somewhere where it can cause some really bad damage. Okay, because everything's connected with the cardiovascular system. All right, that is it for this unit. Please let me know if you have any questions, and we'll see you next time. Bye.